It was just another regular day in the courtroom, or so it seemed. The judge sat, his face stern, his eyes scanning the paperwork before him. His fingers gently tapped the side of the table as he flipped through the pages. His thoughts seemed distant, absorbed in the case he was reviewing. Outside, the world moved on. People walked past the courthouse, unaware of the tense atmosphere inside. The building was full of people waiting for their turn to speak, to have their moment of truth heard. But inside that courtroom, the air felt different today. Heavy. Something was about to happen. But no one could have known that today was no ordinary day. A boy, no older than 10, stood in the witness box, his small body tense, his voice trembling. His small hands gripped the edge of the stand so tightly, his knuckles turned white. His heart was beating fast, and his breath came in quick bursts. He was nervous. But there was something else inside him, something that he couldn't quite explain. His name was Tyrone Matthews. His mother had always told him to be brave, but standing there in front of a room full of people felt impossible. The judge, the lawyers, the people sitting in the audience, all of them were watching him. Tyrone wasn't just any boy. He had always been quiet. People didn't notice him much. He didn't make much noise. He often kept to himself, lost in his thoughts. His teachers said he was a good student, but they also said he was shy. His classmates called him quiet, and sometimes they teased him because he didn't speak up. They didn't know what Tyrone had been through. They didn't know the truth about him. He wasn't a bad boy, not at all. He was a boy who had learned to keep his feelings inside, to hide his pain. Tyrone had learned to stand back and let others take the spotlight. He had learned to be invisible, to be forgotten, to be left alone. People looked at him, but they didn't see him. But today, that would change. With his wide, searching eyes, Tyrone had always looked at the world as if he was trying to understand it. His mother used to tell him stories when he was younger, stories of strength, of overcoming hard times. Tyrone remembered those stories, but now, standing in the witness box, it felt like they didn't matter. What mattered was his truth, and he had waited so long to speak it. People assumed he was just another child struggling through life, a boy forgotten by society. They didn't know what his life had been like. They didn't know how many nights he had stayed awake, wondering where his father was, wishing for answers to the questions that haunted him. Where was his dad? Why wasn't he there when Tyrone needed him most? Tyrone's story wasn't just a sad one. It was a powerful one. Behind those searching eyes was a truth that no one knew. He had a secret that had been hidden from him, from everyone, for years. It was a truth that, when it finally came to light, would shake the very foundation of everyone in that courtroom. For years, Tyrone had lived with the feeling that something was missing. He had been raised by his mother, who loved him very much. But there was always a gap. There was always something, or someone, missing in his life. Every time his friends talked about their fathers, every time they shared stories about their dads taking them fishing or playing sports, Tyrone felt left out. He felt like there was a hole inside him that no one could fill. He had asked his mother once, "Where's my dad?" Her answer had always been vague. "He's not around, Tyrone. He's far away, and it's better that way." But Tyrone didn't believe it. He couldn't. Deep down, he felt that there was more to the story. His mother's eyes would always look away when she spoke about his father, and that made Tyrone even more curious. He spent many nights in his small room, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering. He could feel something, some connection to the world that he didn't fully understand. Something in his heart told him that one day, he would find the answers. One day, he would meet the man who was supposed to be his father. But how? Where? Every time he asked about his father, his mother would change the subject. Tyrone wasn't sure what it was, but something about the way she looked at him when he asked made him believe that his father wasn't just far away, he might be closer than he thought. That was why Tyrone had come here today. He couldn't live with the unknown anymore. His questions had become louder, more insistent. The answers were not in the books his teachers gave him, not in the stories his friends shared. The answers were in that courtroom, in the place where his life would change forever. Tyrone's mother had never talked about his father in a way that made sense. It was as if the man didn't exist. But Tyrone had a feeling that today was different. He had heard rumors, whispers in the hallways of his school, rumors about a man, a judge, who might know something about his father. It was a name Tyrone had heard but never thought much of until today. His father, the man who had been missing from his life, was sitting somewhere in that very room. The judge sat at his desk, looking down at his papers, his face as serious as ever. He had no idea what was coming. No idea that the child in front of him was about to change everything. As Tyrone stood there, feeling the eyes of everyone on him, he knew this was his moment. This was his chance to speak, to ask the question that had haunted him for years. But as he looked at the judge, his heart raced. Could this man be his father? Was he ready for the truth? The courtroom felt quiet, almost too quiet. The soft sound of the clock ticking on the wall echoed in Tyrone's ears. He felt his hands begin to sweat, but he knew he couldn't back down now. He had to ask. He had to know. Your Honor, Tyrone began, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you, my father? The judge's eyes flicked up, locking with Tyrone's. His expression didn't change, but Tyrone could see something behind the judge's eyes, a flicker, a recognition. For a moment, the room was completely still. Tyrone stood there, his heart pounding, waiting for the answer that would change everything. Would the judge say yes? Would the answer finally come? Tyrone didn't know, but one thing was for sure, he was about to find out. And nothing would ever be the same again. The tension was building, and the question that Tyrone had carried inside him for so long was finally about to be answered. But how would the judge respond? Would he be the father Tyrone had longed for all these years? Or was the truth something far more complicated than Tyrone could have imagined? Tyrone stood tall in the witness box, feeling every eye in the room on him. The judge, the lawyers, and the people in the gallery were waiting for his answer. Everyone was on edge, unsure of what would happen next. Tyrone's voice trembled, but it was steady enough to make everyone stop and listen. The answer came slowly. The judge's eyes softened, and his lips parted slightly as if he was struggling to find the right words. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. Tyrone's heart was pounding in his chest. The weight of the question he had just asked hung in the air. He had spent his whole life wondering about his father, and now, in this moment, he was standing before the one man who could answer it. But even as he asked the question, Tyrone wasn't sure if he was ready to hear the truth. The judge's eyes locked with his, and for a brief second, Tyrone thought he saw something flicker in the man's gaze. A shadow of recognition, perhaps. Or was it a memory he was trying to bury? Tyrone wasn't sure, but there was something about the judge's expression that made him feel like the answer was closer than ever before. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath. Even the lawyers, who had been speaking in low murmurs just moments before, were quiet now. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the whole world was waiting for the judge's response. Tyrone's hands clenched tighter on the edge of the witness stand. His palms were slick with sweat. The moment he had imagined in his dreams for so many years was here, but now that it had arrived, it felt overwhelming. The judge took a deep breath, his face still unreadable. For a moment, he didn't speak. His eyes never left Tyrone's, and the boy felt as though the entire weight of his life was hanging on the next few words that would come from this man's mouth. Finally, the judge spoke. His voice was calm, but there was something in it that made Tyrone's heart leap. "Son," the judge said, his voice thick with emotion, I didn't know. I didn't know you were looking for me." The words were simple, but they hit Tyrone like a wave. They were not what he expected to hear. He had imagined many things: angry words, cold dismissals, perhaps even silence, but not this. Not this warmth in the judge's voice. Tyrone felt his knees weaken, but he held himself steady. He needed to hear more. The judge stood up from his desk and walked over to the witness stand. Tyrone's breath caught in his throat as the man approached him. The room seemed to fade away, the noise, the people, the world outside, all became distant, as if this moment belonged to them alone. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tyrone finally asked, his voice small but determined. "Why didn't you tell me you were my father?" The judge's face softened, and for the first time, Tyrone saw a hint of pain in his eyes. He had been so stoic before, so controlled, but now the walls around him were crumbling. The man looked like he was fighting to find the right words. "Tyrone," the judge began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never knew you were mine. I thought I had lost you forever. Your mother, she never told me. She told me it was over between us, and I had no idea she was keeping you from me. I tried to move on with my life, but something inside me always wondered. Something inside me always felt like I was missing a part of myself." Tyrone's heart raced as he listened. He had always imagined what this moment might be like, but never in a million years had he imagined it would be like this. The judge was admitting to a truth that Tyrone had never known: he wasn't the only one who had been searching for answers. His father had been searching too, in his own way. Tyrone took a shaky breath. His voice faltered as he spoke, "But why didn't you come looking for me? Why didn't you try harder?" The judge's face darkened, and Tyrone could see the regret in his eyes. The man looked away for a moment, as if the question had hit him harder than he expected. But after a long pause, he turned back to Tyrone. "I didn't know how," the judge said simply. "I was scared, son. Scared that I had lost my chance to be a father to you. And maybe I was wrong to be afraid. But I didn't know how to fix it. Your mother and I, we didn't end things well. She made it clear she didn't want me in your life. So I stayed away, and I tried to move forward. I thought it was better for you that way." Tyrone was quiet, processing the words, trying to make sense of them. His emotions were a swirl of confusion, pain, and something else: a glimmer of hope. He had spent so many years wondering about this man, wondering if he would ever show up, if he would ever be the father Tyrone had always dreamed of. But now that the man was here, standing before him, the answer wasn't as simple as Tyrone had imagined. His father wasn't some perfect hero, he was a man with his own regrets, his own mistakes. But in that moment, Tyrone realized something. This man, the judge, was trying. He was trying to make things right. And maybe that was enough. "I don't know what to say," Tyrone whispered. "I've wanted to know who you were for so long." The judge's eyes softened, and he reached out, gently resting a hand on Tyrone's shoulder. "You don't have to say anything, son. You don't have to forgive me. All I can do is tell you the truth and hope that, one day, we can build something together. It might take time. But I'll be here for you now. I promise." Tyrone blinked, fighting back tears. He had never imagined this moment would be so complicated. It wasn't the perfect reunion he had dreamed about. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something real. He took a deep breath and nodded. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to try. I want to get to know you." The judge smiled softly, a small but sincere smile. "That's all I can ask for. We'll take it one step at a time." Tyrone stepped down from the witness stand, his legs shaky but his heart lighter than it had ever been. For the first time in his life, he felt like he wasn't alone anymore. The father he had wondered about for so long was right there, beside him. And as they walked out of the courtroom together, side by side, Tyrone couldn't help but feel like a chapter of his life was closing and another, full of possibilities, was just beginning. Tyrone had always felt invisible. It wasn't that he didn't exist, he knew that much. But the world around him seemed to forget about him. Every day, he walked through life unnoticed. At school, he sat in the back of the classroom, trying to make himself small. The other kids laughed and joked around, but Tyrone didn't join in. They never invited him into their games or their conversations. He wasn't the one they asked to sit next to at lunch. They didn't know how it felt to be invisible. They didn't know what it was like to walk down the hallway, feeling the weight of their eyes on you, but not for a reason you wanted. They didn't know what it was like to wear clothes that didn't fit right, to have shoes with holes in them, to feel different from everyone else. Every day, Tyrone could feel the whispers, the stares, the way the other kids pointed and laughed when they thought he wasn't looking. But the hardest part wasn't at school. The hardest part was at home. Tyrone lived with his mother in a small apartment. It wasn't much, but it was home. There were always dishes in the sink, clothes scattered around, and dust on the furniture. His mom worked long hours, and when she was home, she was often too tired to notice him. Tyrone knew she loved him. She told him that every day, but it wasn't always enough. She was always busy. She was always trying to make ends meet. Sometimes, Tyrone would sit in the corner of their small living room, watching his mom work late into the night. She worked at a diner, as a waitress. Her job was hard, and it drained her. She worked long shifts, came home exhausted, and then had to wake up early to do it all over again. There was never enough time for Tyrone. Sometimes, Tyrone wondered if his mom even saw him. He tried talking to her, but she was always too tired, too distracted. She would say things like, "I'm just trying to give us a better life, Tyrone. Don't you understand? This is for you." But Tyrone didn't understand. All he understood was that she wasn't there. He missed her. He missed her attention, her time, and her care. But even in his loneliness, there was one thing that Tyrone never stopped thinking about. One question that haunted him day after day, one answer that he desperately needed. Where was his father? He had heard the other kids talk about their fathers. How their dads would take them to the park, teach them to ride bikes, help them with their homework. They would talk about their fathers like they were heroes, like they were always there for them, no matter what. Tyrone would listen, trying to push down the feeling that grew inside of him, the feeling of emptiness. When he was younger, he didn't understand why he didn't have a dad. His mother would try to comfort him, but her words always felt like a lie. "He's not around, Tyrone. It's for the best," she would say. She would smile gently, but there was always a sadness in her eyes. She would change the subject, like the conversation was over. But Tyrone wasn't satisfied with her answers. He couldn't be. There was something deep inside him, some piece of his heart that refused to accept it. It didn't feel like for the best. It didn't feel right. Why wasn't his dad there? What had happened? Where was the man who was supposed to love him, to protect him, to be there for him? As Tyrone grew older, the questions only became stronger. He had tried asking his mother again and again, but every time, she gave him the same vague response. He had tried asking his teachers, his neighbors, even his friends, though he didn't have many of those, but no one seemed to have the answers. Everyone just shrugged. No one could tell him why he had been left behind. No one could tell him why he felt so alone. He had tried to ignore it, to push the thoughts away, but it was impossible. They crept into his mind at night when he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if his dad was out there somewhere, thinking about him too. Tyrone didn't know why his mother didn't talk about his dad. But he knew one thing: he couldn't live in the dark anymore. He needed to know the truth. He had spent years imagining what his father might be like. Would he be kind? Would he smile like the other dads Tyrone had seen at school events? Or would he be different, cold, and distant, like the way Tyrone's mom described him? Would he even want to know Tyrone? Or had he forgotten about him, just like Tyrone's mother seemed to have forgotten? The more Tyrone thought about it, the more questions piled up. He had to find answers. He had to know. That's when he heard the rumors. It was during one of those long, quiet afternoons when Tyrone had wandered through the halls of the school, lost in his thoughts. He overheard a conversation between two teachers, their voices low, as if they didn't want anyone to hear. "Tyrone Matthews," one teacher said. "I heard he's got a connection to Judge Matthews. Do you think he knows?" The other teacher replied, "No idea. But I heard Judge Matthews has been trying to find him." Tyrone stopped in his tracks. His heart skipped a beat. Judge Matthews? Could it be? Was this the man his mother had always talked about in whispers? Was this the man who might be his father? Tyrone's mind raced. He had to know more. He couldn't just let this go. He needed to find out the truth. The next few days were filled with questions and uncertainty. Tyrone tried to talk to his mother, but every time he brought up Judge Matthews, she would change the subject. She would avoid his gaze, her eyes darting around the room, as if she was afraid to say something. Tyrone knew she was hiding something. But what? Why couldn't she just tell him the truth? Why couldn't she just say who his father was? One night, after his mother had gone to bed, Tyrone sat in the living room, staring at the old family photo album. He had looked through it hundreds of times, but tonight, something felt different. He found himself stopping at a picture of his mother and a man he didn't recognize. The man looked familiar somehow, but Tyrone couldn't place his face. Could it be? Was this Judge Matthews? Was this his father? The questions burned in Tyrone's mind, but he couldn't stop them. He knew he had to find out the truth, no matter how hard it was. And when he made up his mind, there was nothing that would stop him. Tyrone stood there, in the middle of the courtroom, his heart racing faster than ever. The walls of the room seemed to close in around him. He could feel the heat of the eyes on him, the weight of all those people watching, judging him. But it wasn't just their gaze that made his chest tighten. It was the truth he had been searching for his whole life. The truth that he hoped to find today. The judge's eyes were focused on him. Tyrone could feel the sharpness of his stare. The judge wasn't just looking at him like everyone else had. No, there was something more there. Curiosity, maybe. Or something deeper, something that made Tyrone feel like the judge knew more than he was letting on. Tyrone couldn't figure it out. He had never felt so exposed in his life. But at the same time, something inside him was changing. The fear he had felt when he first walked into the courtroom was starting to fade. With every word the judge spoke, with every question he asked, something inside Tyrone was rising. It was courage. It was the courage to ask the questions that had been eating away at him for years. The courage to demand answers. He had spent so long wondering about his father. Was he a good man? Was he someone Tyrone could look up to? Or was he just another man who had abandoned him like everyone else? But now, standing in front of the judge, Tyrone didn't feel so small. He felt like he was finally in the right place. For so long, Tyrone had been invisible. No one saw him. No one cared. He was just another kid in the back of the classroom, just another child lost in the crowd. But today, he wasn't invisible anymore. Today, he was standing in the spotlight. The judge's voice broke through his thoughts. "Tyrone," he said, his voice calm but firm, "why are you here? What do you want from me?" Tyrone's stomach flipped. The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. His mother had always told him not to ask too many questions about his father. She had always said it was for the best that Tyrone didn't know. But Tyrone knew better now. He couldn't keep running away from the truth. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. I want to know who my father is," he said, his voice shaking just a little, but the words came out. "I want to know why he's not here. Why I've never known him." The judge didn't speak for a moment. He just stared at Tyrone, his eyes narrowing as if he was considering something important. Tyrone couldn't read his face, but he didn't look angry. He didn't look upset. The judge just looked thoughtful. Tyrone's mind raced. Could the judge be his father? Was he the one who had been missing all this time? Tyrone couldn't be sure. There was so much that didn't make sense. Why had his mother kept the secret from him? Why had she never told him the truth about his father? And then, Tyrone noticed something. It was small, but it sent a shock through him. The man sitting behind the lawyer's desk, the one who had been silent for most of the hearing, he was staring at Tyrone now, and his gaze was intense. There was something about the way he looked at Tyrone that made Tyrone's heart skip a beat. The man looked almost familiar. Was it possible? Could this be his father? Tyrone's mind swirled with confusion. He had no idea who the man was, but there was something about his face, something about his eyes, that felt like he had seen them before. The man didn't smile. He didn't say anything. But Tyrone couldn't shake the feeling that this was the key to everything. Was this the man he had been looking for all his life? Was this the person who could answer all his questions? The judge's voice broke through Tyrone's thoughts again. "Tyrone," the judge said, his tone softer now, "I understand you have questions. I understand you want answers. But sometimes, the truth is harder to face than we expect. Are you ready for that?" Tyrone felt a chill run down his spine. What did the judge mean? Was there something about the truth that Tyrone wasn't prepared for? For a moment, he hesitated. He thought about his mother, about how she had always told him to forget about his father. She had always said it was better that way. But deep down, Tyrone knew he couldn't forget. He couldn't ignore the feeling in his heart, the feeling that there was more to his story than he had been told. And right now, in this moment, standing in front of the judge, he knew it was time to face whatever came next. "I'm ready," Tyrone said, his voice more confident than he felt. "I'm ready to know the truth." The judge nodded slowly, his face softening. He seemed to consider Tyrone's words, weighing them carefully. Then, he stood up from his chair and walked toward Tyrone. For the first time, the judge's face was close enough for Tyrone to see the wrinkles around his eyes, the deep lines that spoke of years of experience, of a life lived in the public eye. Tyrone didn't know what to expect, but he wasn't prepared for what happened next. The judge placed a hand on his shoulder, and for the briefest moment, Tyrone felt a sense of connection, something he hadn't felt before. It was as if the judge was saying, without words, that he understood. He understood the pain Tyrone had carried with him all these years. "You're right," the judge said, his voice quiet now, almost a whisper. "You have every right to know the truth. And I owe you that. I never thought I would be the one to tell you." Tyrone's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. What did the judge mean? Was he really about to tell Tyrone something that would change his life forever? But just as Tyrone opened his mouth to speak, the courtroom door suddenly swung open. The sound echoed in the silent room, and everyone turned their heads toward the noise. Tyrone's stomach dropped. His eyes locked onto the figure standing in the doorway. It was the man who had been sitting behind the lawyer's desk. The man who had been staring at him. The man who looked so familiar. Tyrone's mind raced. Could it really be? Was this the moment? The man stepped into the room, his footsteps slow but confident. As he moved forward, Tyrone's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. This was the moment when everything changed. The man was walking toward him. Toward the truth. Judge Matthews, the man said, his voice deep and calm. I think it's time you told him. Tyrone's breath caught in his throat. His hands shook slightly, and he had to fight the urge to look away. This was the moment. This was the moment he had been waiting for. But the judge didn't speak. He didn't look at Tyrone, but instead, he turned his gaze toward the man who had just entered. There was something in the judge's eyes, a hesitation, a weight that made Tyrone's stomach twist. What are you saying? The judge asked, his voice low. The man didn't answer right away. He stepped closer to Tyrone and placed a hand on his shoulder, just as the judge had done. Tyrone looked up at him, trying to read his face, trying to understand what was happening. You know what I'm saying, the man replied. It's time. He deserves the truth. Tyrone couldn't speak. He couldn't move. All he could do was stare at the man, his heart racing. Who was this man? Could he really be his father? The courtroom was silent, waiting for the next words, for the next revelation that would change everything. Tyrone's heart was beating so fast, he thought it might burst out of his chest. His mind was racing, jumping from one thought to another, each more confusing than the last. He felt as if the whole world had stopped moving, as if time had frozen just for him. There, standing before him, was the man who had been silent all along, the man who seemed to know more than Tyrone had ever realized. Was this man really his father? Tyrone couldn't be sure, but the way he felt his hand on his shoulder, it made his heart ache. The courtroom was silent. Not a sound could be heard except for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall, echoing in the stillness. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, but Tyrone wasn't sure what that something was. The air felt heavy, filled with a sense of expectation. It was as if everyone in the room knew something important was about to happen, something that would change everything for Tyrone. The judge, too, seemed to be waiting, his face unreadable. He looked at the man who had just walked in, and then his eyes moved to Tyrone. There was something in the way the judge looked at him that made Tyrone feel both hopeful and uncertain at the same time. The judge's face had softened, but his expression was still serious. It was clear that this moment was not just about Tyrone asking questions anymore. It was about more than that. Tyrone, the judge said softly, breaking the silence, are you sure you want to hear the truth? Tyrone stood frozen for a moment. Was he sure? Could he handle it? Could he face the truth, no matter how hard it might be? All his life, he had felt like something was missing. He had felt like a piece of himself was missing. And now, standing here, with this man in front of him and the judge's words in the air, Tyrone realized he couldn't turn back. He had to know. He had to find out who he really was. Yes, Tyrone answered, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I have to know. Please. The man who had walked in stood silently for a moment, looking at Tyrone with an intensity that made Tyrone's chest tighten. The man's face was calm, but there was a sadness in his eyes that Tyrone couldn't understand. It was as if the man knew the truth would hurt Tyrone, but it was a truth he needed to hear. You deserve to know, Tyrone, the man said, his voice soft but firm. You deserve the truth about who you are. Tyrone's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the man, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. The man's words felt like they were unraveling something deep inside of him, something that had been hidden for so long. Tyrone felt a tear threaten to fall from his eye, but he held it back. He wouldn't cry, not now, not in front of all these people. He had to be strong. The man took another step closer, and Tyrone could see the pain in his eyes. It was as if the man was struggling with something that hurt him just as much as it hurt Tyrone. "Tyrone," the man said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm your father." The words hit Tyrone like a bolt of lightning. For a moment, everything went black. His heart stopped. His mind went numb. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to react. Could it really be? Was this man truly his father? The courtroom remained quiet, but Tyrone's mind was anything but still. It was spinning. The world around him seemed to blur, the faces of the people in the room becoming distant. His hands trembled as he reached up to rub his eyes. Was he hearing things? Was he imagining it? "You," Tyrone whispered, his voice barely audible. He felt his breath catch in his throat. "You're my father." The man nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret. "Yes," he said. "I know this must be a shock to you, Tyrone. I've wanted to tell you for so long, but I couldn't. I wasn't in a place to be the father you deserved. But now I'm ready. I'm ready to be a part of your life." Tyrone stood frozen, his mind racing. His father? The man who had never been there for him, the man who had never shown up when Tyrone needed him most? Was he really telling the truth? How could he be? "But, why?" Tyrone asked, his voice shaking. "Why weren't you there? Why did you leave me and my mom?" The man looked away, unable to meet Tyrone's eyes for a moment. I made mistakes, Tyrone," he said quietly. "I wasn't ready. I wasn't in the right place in my life to be the father you needed. I thought it was better to stay away, but now I realize how wrong I was." Tyrone's chest tightened. It felt like 1,000 emotions were crashing down on him all at once. Anger. Hurt. Confusion. He had spent so many years feeling abandoned, feeling like there was something wrong with him, like he wasn't good enough. And now, here was this man telling him he was his father, telling him it was all a mistake. But could he believe him? Could he forgive him for the years of silence, for the pain he had caused? I don't know what to say," Tyrone said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How can I trust you? How can I just forgive you?" The man stepped closer to him, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Tyrone. I don't even expect you to trust me. But I want you to know that I'm here now. I'm ready to be the father you deserve. I can't change the past, but I can make the future better. And I promise you, I'll never leave you again." Tyrone felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't speak. He didn't know what to feel. His emotions were all tangled up inside him, making it hard to think clearly. He had always dreamed of this moment, dreamed of his father coming back into his life. But now that it was happening, it felt like too much to handle. The judge, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "Tyrone," he said gently, "this is a lot to process. But you have a right to ask questions. You have a right to know everything. Your father wants to be a part of your life now. That's the most important thing. It's up to you to decide how you want to move forward." Tyrone glanced at the judge, then back at the man who had just told him the truth. His mind was still spinning, but one thing was clear. This moment of truth wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. "I don't know if I'm ready," Tyrone said quietly, his voice full of uncertainty. "But I'll try. I'll try to understand." The man nodded, his face softening. "That's all I can ask for, Tyrone." The courtroom felt quieter now, the tension lifting just a little. But for Tyrone, it felt like everything had changed in an instant. He was no longer the invisible boy. He was no longer alone. The man standing before him was his father, the person he had been searching for all his life. But now, the real journey was about to begin. Then, it happened. The judge turned his gaze toward Tyrone, his voice steady but full of weight. "Tyrone, I need to ask you something important. Do you know who you are? Do you know who you belong to?" Tyrone's lips parted. His heart pounded louder than ever. He swallowed, his throat dry, but then he looked up at the judge, his eyes wide, filled with a mix of hope and confusion. And then, with a voice breaking through the silence, Tyrone said, "You're my father." A hush fell over the courtroom. Everyone froze, unsure of what they had just heard. The judge stood still, his expression unreadable, his eyes never leaving Tyrone's face. The weight of the moment hung in the air, heavy and thick. And then, Tyrone did the unthinkable. He broke down in tears. The tears were a flood. They came faster than Tyrone could have ever imagined. They spilled down his face, one after another, until his vision was blurred and his heart felt like it might burst from the raw emotion. He was standing there, in front of everyone, unable to control the tears, unable to keep the floodgates shut any longer. All the years of wondering, all the years of pain, had built up to this moment. And now it was pouring out of him. He had waited so long for this day. He had spent years dreaming of this moment, dreaming of a time when he would finally know the truth. And now that it was happening, it felt like it was too much to bear. The truth was finally here, and it was overwhelming. His father, the man he had longed to know, was standing before him. But even though it was everything Tyrone had wished for, it was still so hard to believe. Was this really happening? The room was silent. The courtroom had been turned upside down by the revelation. The judge, the lawyers, the onlookers, everyone was watching Tyrone, waiting for him to say something more, waiting for him to say what they all needed to hear. But Tyrone couldn't speak. He could only cry. He could only feel the weight of it all. The man, his father, stepped forward. His face was filled with regret, filled with a pain that mirrored Tyrone's own. He reached out and placed a hand on Tyrone's trembling shoulder, his touch warm but careful. Tyrone flinched at the contact, but he didn't pull away. He didn't know what to do, but he didn't want to push his father away. This man had come back into his life after so many years, and even though Tyrone's heart was breaking, he didn't want to lose him again. "I know it's a lot to take in," the man said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I promise you, Tyrone, I've spent every single day of my life regretting the fact that I wasn't there for you. I didn't deserve to be your father, not when I left. But I am here now, and I want to make things right." Tyrone looked up at him through his tear-filled eyes, his breath catching in his throat. "How could you just leave me? How could you leave me and Mom alone for all those years?" The man's face faltered. He took a deep breath, his own eyes welling with tears. "I was young, Tyrone. I was scared. I thought I wasn't ready to be a father, that I wasn't good enough. But I see now how wrong I was. I should have fought for you. I should have been there." Tyrone shook his head, still not fully understanding, still feeling that empty ache inside of him. "You should have been there for me. You should have." He stopped. The words wouldn't come. The emotions were too powerful, too tangled up inside him. He was angry, yes, but there was something else too, something softer, something that made his chest ache with the desire to reach out. For so long, he had felt abandoned, lost, and unimportant. But now, standing here in this courtroom, faced with the truth, Tyrone didn't know how to feel. For years, he had imagined what it would be like if his father came back. He had imagined what he would say, what he would do. But now that the moment had arrived, it was nothing like he had expected. His father was here, but everything still felt so broken. The wounds that had been left open for so long were deep, and Tyrone didn't know if they could ever be healed. "Dad," Tyrone whispered, barely able to say the word, but it slipped out anyway, softer than a breath. He looked up at the man standing before him, the man who was supposed to be his father. "Dad, I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can trust you. You left me for so long." The words stung, but they needed to be said. Tyrone's heart ached as he spoke them, but they were the truth. He had to let them out, had to say what had been locked inside for so many years. The man's face crumpled with pain. He took another step forward, his eyes locked on Tyrone's. "I know, son," he said quietly. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't expect you to forgive me now. But I'm here. I'll be here, whenever you're ready. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for the years I lost." Tyrone's chest tightened, and more tears began to fall. The flood had started again, and it seemed there was no stopping it. His heart was heavy with so many feelings: hurt, sadness, confusion, and even a small spark of hope. He had never expected his father to show up this way, to apologize, to say the things Tyrone had always wanted to hear. But it didn't change the fact that so much time had been wasted, so much had been lost. The judge, who had been silently watching the exchange, finally spoke. "Tyrone," he said softly, "this is a powerful moment. It's not easy to confront the past, especially when it hurts. But the truth is, you have the power to decide what happens next. You are in control of your own story now. You can choose whether or not to forgive. You can choose how you want to move forward. But just remember, the future doesn't have to be like the past." Tyrone looked at the judge, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders, just a little. His gaze moved back to his father. There was a long silence between them, as Tyrone let the judge's words settle in his heart. "I don't know what comes next," Tyrone said finally, his voice quieter now, but still steady. "But I'll try. I'll try to figure this out. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I want to try." His father nodded, his face filled with gratitude. "That's all I can ask for, Tyrone." "Thank you." Tyrone's tears slowed, and he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The courtroom was still. No one spoke for a long moment. But in that silence, something shifted. There was a small seed of hope planted in Tyrone's heart. A seed that, maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something new. A beginning where the past didn't define him. A beginning where the future could still hold something better. Tyrone wiped his eyes again, feeling the rawness of the moment. The tears weren't just from the revelation. They were from everything that had built up over the years: the loneliness, the questions, the yearning for a father who had never been there. The boy who had stood there, forgotten by so many, now had a chance to stand tall. But it didn't feel easy. It didn't feel simple. The judge's voice broke through the heavy silence. "This is a remarkable moment, Tyrone. You've faced so much in your young life. You've been brave enough to speak your truth here today, in front of everyone. That's not easy." Tyrone nodded slowly. He wasn't sure he felt brave, but hearing those words from the judge somehow made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could find the strength to take the next step. His father, still standing close by, didn't say anything immediately. It was clear he was holding back his emotions. The regret in his eyes spoke volumes more than words ever could. But there was something else in his gaze, too. A flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he thought, this could be the beginning of something new. Perhaps the years apart didn't have to define their future together. Tyrone looked up at him again, still unsure. It was overwhelming. There was a part of him that wanted to scream, to shout at his father for abandoning him all those years ago. He could feel the anger bubbling inside of him, the hurt, the frustration. But at the same time, something else was emerging. Something small, fragile, but strong, forgiveness. Could he forgive the man who had walked away from him? Could he really accept him into his life after all this time? Tyrone felt a tug in his chest, pulling him in two directions. Part of him wanted to run away from it all, to shut down and never face this man again. But there was another part of him, a part he couldn't ignore, that wanted to understand, that wanted to heal. That part of him wanted to give his father a chance. "I don't know how to do this," Tyrone whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know what to say. It's all so much. But I don't want to run away from it either." His father stepped forward again, gently resting a hand on Tyrone's shoulder. His voice was soft, laced with emotion. "It's okay, Tyrone. You don't have to have all the answers right now. I don't expect you to forgive me today, or ever, if that's not what you want. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'll always be here." Tyrone nodded, but there was still so much uncertainty swirling inside him. The weight of the past, the broken years, the missed moments, it all felt too big to comprehend. How could he just accept that everything had changed? How could he trust that his father wouldn't leave again? But before Tyrone could say anything more, the judge's voice rang out once again, strong and firm. "You don't need to have everything figured out in a single moment. This is not the end of your journey, it's just the beginning. The past is something we can't change, Tyrone. But how you move forward, how you decide to rebuild what's broken, that's what matters." Tyrone's eyes met the judge's. There was something comforting in his words, something that made the weight of the situation feel just a little bit lighter. The judge had been right. It didn't all have to make sense today. It didn't have to all be fixed in a single breath. Maybe, just maybe, the future could still hold something good. His father, sensing Tyrone's inner turmoil, spoke once more, this time with a gentleness that seemed to bridge the gap between them. "Tyrone, I can't promise you that everything will be perfect. I can't promise that I'll never make mistakes again. But what I can promise is that I'll be here for you. I'll try every day to be the father you deserve." The words were simple, but they carried weight. For the first time, Tyrone felt something stir inside him. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was something close. It was hope. He didn't know what came next, and that frightened him. But he also realized something that gave him a flicker of peace. His journey wasn't over. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just another chapter, and he had the power to decide what happened next. The room was still, the quiet of the courtroom only broken by the sound of Tyrone's soft breathing, the faint sniffles as he wiped away the last of his tears. His father, still standing by his side, didn't rush him. He didn't push. He simply waited. And Tyrone, in that moment, realized that he didn't need to have everything figured out right away. He could take his time. The future could still be written, and he could still have a say in how it would unfold. As Tyrone took a deep breath, something inside him shifted. Maybe there was hope for him after all. Maybe his story wasn't one of endless pain and loneliness. Maybe it was one that still had room for healing. And for the first time in a long while, Tyrone allowed himself to believe that he could move forward. He could rebuild, step by step, starting with this moment. The judge nodded, as though he understood Tyrone's quiet decision. "You've made a powerful step today, Tyrone. But it's just the beginning. What you choose to do next is what will truly define you." Tyrone didn't have all the answers. He still had many questions. But in that moment, he knew he didn't have to face them alone. His father was here. The truth had been revealed. And maybe, just maybe, they could begin again. Tyrone glanced up at his father once more, his voice steady despite the emotions still churning inside him. "I don't know where this goes, but I'll try. I'll try to make it work." And with that, a new chapter began. The room remained still as Tyrone continued to weep, his small body shaking with emotions that had been building up for years. Every tear that fell seemed to wash away a little more of the anger and confusion that had filled his heart. For so long, he had been carrying a weight, one that most kids his age couldn't even begin to imagine. But now, with everything starting to change, he was slowly releasing that burden. Slowly, he was learning how to breathe again. The judge, his father, wasn't just a man behind the bench anymore. He was someone who had taken responsibility for his actions, someone who had acknowledged the mistakes he had made. It wasn't just about the court case. It was about the future they could now share, a future that Tyrone had never dared to hope for. "Thank you," Tyrone managed to whisper, his voice raw and thick with emotion. It was all he could say, but the words held so much meaning. He was grateful. He was relieved. But most of all, he was finally beginning to feel something he hadn't felt in years: hope. His father, Tyrone's judge, gently squeezed his hand. "There's no need to thank me, son," he said, his voice deep and sincere. "I'm sorry it took me so long to realize what mattered most. But I promise you, I will make it right. I will be here for you, every step of the way." Tyrone looked up at his father, his eyes still swollen from crying. His father was a tall man, strong-looking, but now, he seemed softer, somehow vulnerable even. The man who had once been a distant figure, barely even a memory, was now standing in front of him, offering him something that Tyrone had only dreamed of. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to trust that his father would keep his word. But a small part of him, the part that had been hurt so many times before, was still unsure. Could he really trust someone who had been absent for so long? Could he really rely on this man who had been just a shadow in his life for all these years? But as he looked into his father's eyes, Tyrone saw something he hadn't seen before: sincerity. He saw the regret, yes, but he also saw the determination. His father wasn't just saying the words, he meant them. Tyrone could feel it deep in his chest, that small flicker of belief that had been dormant for so long, now beginning to grow. Maybe it was time to let go of the past. Maybe it was time to start building something new. The judge stood up, his robe flowing behind him as he walked toward the bench. He raised his gavel, and with a soft thud, he struck it against the wood. "The case is closed," he said, his voice steady. "Tyrone Matthews is no longer alone. He has the right to know his father, to know the truth. This is just the beginning of a new chapter for him, one where he will no longer have to face the world by himself." The words echoed through the courtroom, and for a moment, everything felt surreal. Was this really happening? Tyrone had always imagined what it would be like to hear someone stand up for him, to speak the words that would give him the freedom he had longed for. But now that it was happening, it felt almost too good to be true. The pain, the anger, the sadness, it was all still there, just beneath the surface, but it was slowly being replaced by something else: the chance for a future with a father who cared. The judge turned to the crowd in the courtroom, his voice commanding attention. "We have witnessed a moment today that will change this boy's life forever. Tyrone Matthews deserves the opportunity to grow, to be loved, and to have the support he needs. No one can undo the past, but we can make the future brighter. And that is what we will do." The room was filled with murmurs of agreement. Even those who had been skeptical, who had questioned the judge's decisions, seemed to feel the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just a legal case. This was about something much more important: the chance for redemption, the chance to repair what had been broken, and the chance for a family to come together after years of separation. Tyrone's eyes welled up again, but this time, it wasn't with sadness. It was with something else, something that was hard to describe. It was a mixture of relief, joy, and hope. His life was changing, and for the first time, he felt like he was finally heading in the right direction. The judge, his father, came back to Tyrone's side, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. Tyrone stiffened at first, but then he relaxed, letting his father pull him in closer. It felt strange, but it also felt right. This was his father. The man who had always been a distant figure in his life was now here, holding him, promising to be there for him. The overwhelming sense of gratitude he felt in that moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The judge leaned down and whispered, "We have a lot to talk about, son. But I promise you, we'll take it one step at a time." Tyrone nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. There was so much they needed to say, so much they needed to understand about each other. But for now, all he could do was hold on to this moment, the moment when everything began to change. As they left the courtroom, Tyrone's heart was full. It was still fragile, still uncertain, but it was full of something new. Something he hadn't known he could feel: hope. Hope that his father could change, that they could rebuild what had been lost. Hope that he didn't have to be invisible anymore. He had been seen. He had been heard. And now, he had a chance to live a life he had never imagined. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Tyrone felt like he had a say in what happened next. He wasn't alone anymore. And that was all he needed to know. And so, they walked out of the courtroom together, father and son, side by side, ready to begin the next chapter of their story. Sometimes, the answers we seek don't come when we expect them. Sometimes, they come when we least expect it, when we've suffered enough, when we've lost enough, and when we finally have the courage to ask. For Tyrone Matthews, that moment came when he stood in front of a judge, the very man who had been absent from his life for so long. Tyrone had asked for the truth, and when it finally came, it was far more than he ever dreamed of. It was a truth that, in the end, gave him not only the answers he had been seeking for years but a future that he had once thought was impossible. The journey Tyrone had traveled had not been easy. He had faced years of rejection, loneliness, and pain. He had been that child in the corner of the room, invisible to the world around him. People saw him as just another boy, struggling through life without anyone to help him. His mother was always too busy, too caught up in her own battles to notice the needs of her son. And his father? He had been nothing more than a shadow, a figure lost in the fog of memory and unanswered questions. But Tyrone didn't give up. Even when he felt invisible, even when the weight of the world seemed too heavy to bear, he held on. He kept searching, kept asking, and kept hoping that one day, someone would see him for who he truly was. He had no idea how or when it would happen, but he knew deep down that he was meant for more than just a life of struggle. He had the strength within him to find the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. And then, one day, everything changed. In a courtroom that felt cold and foreign, Tyrone stood up and spoke the words that would change his life forever. "You're my father." The moment those words left his lips, the world around him shifted. The judge, his father, looked down at him, a mix of surprise and recognition in his eyes. The silence that followed was thick, like a blanket covering everything in the room. The weight of the years, the distance between father and son, hung in the air. And for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped spinning, as if everything that had led them to that point was suddenly wrapped up in that one moment. But Tyrone's journey wasn't just about finding his father. It was about finding himself, too. It was about realizing that the love and support he had been searching for didn't always come from the places he expected. Sometimes, it comes from within. Sometimes, it takes a moment of deep pain to bring the clarity needed to understand what really matters. And sometimes, it takes the courage to speak your truth out loud, no matter how hard it may be, no matter how much fear and doubt cloud your mind. In that moment, when Tyrone spoke to the judge, he was not just revealing the truth about his father. He was revealing the truth about himself. He was showing the world that he was no longer willing to hide, no longer willing to accept being invisible. He was standing tall, a boy who had endured so much and yet still had the courage to ask for what he needed. And his father, the judge, saw that. He saw the boy in front of him not as a reminder of the past, but as a son who had grown strong despite everything he had been through. The judge realized that he had missed so much, but in that moment, he also realized that it wasn't too late. It wasn't too late to be the father Tyrone needed. Sometimes, the family we've been waiting for is not the family we thought we lost, but the family we never knew we needed. It's not just about finding the people who are supposed to love us, but about realizing that the people who matter most are the ones who show up when it counts. For Tyrone, it was his father the judge who had finally seen him, finally recognized his worth. It wasn't just about being a legal parent, it was about being present, about showing up and saying, "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." And so, Tyrone's life began to change. The walls that had surrounded him for so long, the walls of pain, abandonment, and loneliness, slowly started to crumble. His father was there now. Not just as a figure in the courtroom, but as a real, living person who cared, who wanted to be part of his life. And Tyrone was learning to trust that, to open up to the possibility of a future filled with love, understanding, and hope. The path ahead was still uncertain. Tyrone knew there would be challenges, obstacles, and moments of doubt. But now, he had the strength to face them. He had a father who would stand by him, a family that would support him, and a future that was full of possibilities. As they walked out of the courtroom that day, side by side, father and son, Tyrone couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, heard, and valued. And that was everything. It's funny how life works. We spend so much time searching for answers, hoping for things to change, wishing for a better tomorrow. But sometimes, the answers we need come in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes, they come when we've lost everything we thought mattered, and we finally have the courage to ask for something more. For Tyrone, the journey was long. It was filled with heartache, confusion, and moments of deep loneliness. But in the end, it was worth it. Because the truth he had been searching for, the truth that had seemed so far out of reach, was the very thing that set him free. And it's the same for all of us. We all have moments in life when we feel lost, when we wonder if we'll ever find our way. But the key is not to give up, not to stop searching for what truly matters. Because the answers are out there. Sometimes, they come when we least expect them. And when they do, they have the power to change everything. Tyrone's story is a reminder that no matter how difficult the journey may seem, no matter how long we have to wait for the answers, there is always hope. There is always a chance for things to get better. And sometimes, all it takes is the courage to ask the right questions and to believe that, one day, the answers will come. So, to anyone who feels like they're lost, or invisible, or stuck in a world that doesn't seem to care, they can take heart. Like Tyrone, there is always a chance for a new beginning. There is always a chance for redemption. And there is always the possibility that the family we've been searching for, the love we've been longing for, is closer than we think. Sometimes, it's just waiting for us to have the courage to ask.